Welcome to St. Louis on the Air. I'm Don Marsh. Today we look at the year 1849. That was the year of a devastating cholera epidemic and the great riverfront fire that razed much of the St. Louis riverfront. These events and others are detailed in author Christopher Allen Gordon's new book titled Fire, Pestilence, and Death, St. Louis, 1849. He's the director of library and collections with the Missouri Historical Society. Christopher Allen Gordon, welcome to St. Louis on the Air.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Let me tell you, I really enjoyed the book. As a history major in college and with the society for 15 years, it must have been a lot of fun to dig through all that information.
It was. It was a whole lot of fun. And it was years of finding some, very fascinating letters, very emotional letters, diaries, going through newspapers. One of the things that was probably the most fun in researching this book is I was able to go through the 1849 St. Louis, Missouri Republican day by day, and you really get the feel of the times. You begin know the city, you know the people. It's a very intimate way of looking at history, and by the time the book was finished, I felt like these people were my relatives for the most part.
That's the feeling one gets in reading the book, really familiarity with what the place was like. And you're still finding material. You have to write another book.
Yeah, I know. I'm finding new letters and new documents all the time and thinking, why didn't I include this? It's just the way it goes, though.
Yeah. Well, let's set the stage. What was St. Louis like in 1849?
Well, it was a time when really the entire country was going through a lot of transition. And this was brought about by, the Industrial Revolution is growing in the country. Immigrants are just pouring into the United States from Europe. And this was really causing a lot of cultural change. The society was becoming much more mobile. And St. Louis, as it sits on the river near the confluence of the two great rivers, was really a funnel. I mean, so many of these people were coming through St. Louis. And the town had essentially been, for some 60 years, more or less a frontier town. And now, all these tens of thousands of people are pouring through, and many of them are settling here. And it was a great burden on the city. And so you would have all these masses of people trying to find housing, and, the city is trying to deal with infrastructure problems. The streets were horrible. They were muddy when it rained. They were horribly dusty when it dried, and when it was dry. And there was barely any sewer systems and things like that. One of the things that was most shocking is when you go through the letters and go through the newspapers and so forth, how many times people talk about how filthy the city was. Yeah. It must have just been absolutely horrible.
Well, we mustn't forget the animals that were leaving deposits along the way as well.
It was the animals that are, of course, everyone was riding a horse or they were using oxen. But there were also things like stray pigs just running around the city, So, there was waste in that sense, but there was just, refuse. There were constant articles I came across about how, there was no trash pickup like we have nowadays, obviously. So if there was an open lot or a back alley, people just threw their garbage back there. That was how they got rid of things. So it must have been very, very pungent, and it must have been quite an eyesore for the most part as well.
You didn't mention one other thing that was going on, a little event called the Gold Rush.
And the Gold Rush,
a lot of people were coming through to head farther west.
Yeah, so on top of the strain that the city was already experiencing, they just, in 1848, they discovered gold out in California, and it takes a while for that to be verified. But once people back east found out that there was indeed gold, everyone wanted to head west. And again, St. Louis is right in the way. and they were coming through. And this would again put strain on the city, but it also made a lot of people rich. There was a lot of merchants here that capitalized on that, and there were camps essentially that were set up outside the city of St. Louis, all along the edges of the city, where people were waiting for their steamboats or they were waiting to take the trails out west, and they were buying their provisions here, and it made a lot of people rich. So.
Well, all of those people in one place, crowded under filthy conditions, the place was ripe for pestilence.
It was definitely right, but that's right.
In more ways than one.
Yeah. So, yes. So you had a lot of water that was laying around in the streets. You had, people might not realize there was actually a large body of water downtown in St. Louis, essentially where Union Station is now. It was called Chateau's Pond. It was a man-made lake. It was a sizable body of water. And for years, it had been a stream and a lake where people fished and bathed and so forth. But, as I said before, this was the time of the Industrial Revolution, and those factories were just beginning to be built in St. Louis, and a number of them were built along the edge of the pond, and they were using it as a waste dump, essentially. So you had this industrial waste that's being poured into Chateau's Pond. But on top of that, there was the unfortunate circumstance that in Europe, the cholera epidemic had started again. There had been it became a pandemic, a worldwide pandemic, and all these immigrant ships that were coming over from Europe are, unknowingly taking the disease with them. And it hits New Orleans first, essentially in late 1848, and it comes up the river. It spreads up the river. It is it's a waterborne disease in many ways.
They didn't know that then.
And they had no idea. The medicine was not much different from medieval medicine, really, at this time. They had no sense of what was called germ theory, that germs ever even existed. And so bacteria was completely foreign to them. And there was all kinds of crazy ideas about what actually caused the cholera. The most common was something that had existed from the time of the ancient Greeks, was that it was bad air. It was just that smelly, putrid air. You breathe it in, and it's going to disrupt your health. It's going to disrupt your system. And so one of the ways that they tried to combat the cholera was to burn things that they thought would purify the air. The only thing is, purifying is a very relative term, because they're burning sulfur, they're burning tar. And so each night, as the streets kind of shut down for the evening, they would burn these barrels. The city must have been it must have been unbelievable.
They did have a dress rehearsal for the 1849 cholera epidemic about a generation earlier, 17, 18 years prior.
Yeah. The cholera first shows up in St. Louis in 1833. There were far fewer deaths, obviously, because the population was so much smaller. But it did allow some of the physicians that were still, alive in 1849. It gave them that prior experience. One of the interesting things about their experiences and what they learned to overcome the cholera, or to treat the cholera, I should say, is that many of them prescribed tea. They told people to drink tea, and they noticed that this did help. Well, it helps because cholera essentially kills through dehydration. You lose all your fluids, and you lose it in a very short amount of time. Well, they were rehydrating people. They didn't really even know that, but they had stumbled across this years before, and despite the fact that there were, as you can imagine, all this quackery was going on, or people just taking shots in the dark, it was simple things like just giving people hot tea that would essentially help them, cure them.
How many people, or do we actually know how many people died as a result of the 1849 epidemic?
Well, we have the official number, which is around 4,500 people. But there's really no way of truly understanding because people were passing through the city, and they would contract it here, and then they would leave the city and they would die elsewhere. There were certainly groups, certainly some of the immigrant groups and so forth, that were probably way underrepresented. Often it's been said that at least 10% of the population died, and that's accurate as far as we know, but it was probably a much higher number.
I've seen estimates that 10,000 might be realistic.
Yeah. And that is certainly something that could be true.
One of the today it's humorous, I guess, but I found it so in reading your book. One of the things that happened during this time was the city fathers, the city leaders, got out of Dodge when they saw this happening. They just left and left the civilians to run the place.
Exactly, and that was one of the most shocking things that I discovered when I was doing this research. Is that when things became truly dangerous, and it looked like the city was just and the disease was just overtaking everything, the city council essentially gave power to this committee of public health, and then they left, with the exception of the mayor, Mayor Berry, who really is one of the heroes of the story because he stays and he works with the committee of public health and keeps the city operating, essentially, while so many other people, simply left town because they were so fearful.
Were they still using tea as kind of a remedy in 1849 as they did earlier, or how else were they treating these people?
Yeah, the tea was something, they would prescribe camphor tea and things like that. But there were other bizarre additions they would make, like capsaicin, which is like the oil in hot peppers. There were some people that added things like gunpowder to these remedies. Just very unusual concoctions. But again, because they had these water bases to them, it essentially would help the people out.
And it was just ironically a few years later, I guess it was in Britain, where they discovered that human waste contaminating the water basically is what the cause of the cholera was.
Yeah.
Too late for St. Louis.
Yeah, it essentially was, and that explains why there was such a high mortality rate among women and children. It's because of this, changing diapers and things like that. Yeah.
Got to take a break. We're talking with Christopher Allen Gordon. He is the Director of Library and Collections with the Missouri Historical Society and the author of Fire, Pestilence, and Death, St. Louis, 1849. That's what we're talking about. We'll come back and continue the conversation in just a moment. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU. And welcome back to our conversation with Christopher Allen Gordon, the author of Fire, Pestilence, and Death in St. Louis, 1849. Well, we've covered the cholera epidemic. Let's move on to the next event of 1849. You mentioned earlier that fire was sometimes thought to be a possible means of cleaning the air and ridding it of disease, bacteria, and what have you. Well, we had a dilly in 1849. Do we know what caused that fire?
Well, not exactly. It certainly could have been accidental. There is some evidence that suggests that it was actually intentionally set. It was an arson that was set for the sake of collecting insurance on one of the steamboats. It begins down at the levee, and the levee was, it was the center of the city essentially in terms of commerce and business. These steamboats were densely packed for about a mile along the levee, And so when you had something like a fire breakout, it's very easily for it to spread. And steamboats were known for being tinderboxes for the most part. The wood would dry out very quickly. The average age of a steamboat was about 5 years. And so there was a steamboat that was actually parked down on the levee called the White Cloud. It had been sitting there for a few days, not running for various reasons. And a fire breaks out on one of the upper decks, internal cabins, and it spread quickly through the steamboat, and it sets one of the other boats on fire that immediately adjacent. And it was at that point, not long after that point, it seems like a good, pretty steady breeze picks up, and it was blowing from the northeast, which was not good because that was blowing directly towards the city, toward the buildings. St. Louis was a very busy port. It was the second largest port on the Mississippi next to New Orleans. And so these warehouses that were along the levee would fill up very quickly, so much so that they often had to put the freight on the levee itself. And these are things like bales of cotton, bales of hemp. There were barrels of bacon that were sitting out there. It was like a perfect tinder for a fire.
What was the actual scope of the damage? Do we know how many boats, for instance, or how many warehouses? I mean, the whole riverfront was just basically gone when it was over.
Exactly. It was some 23 boats in all, because not only were they stacked or moored, I should say, so close together. But the Edward Bates, the boat that was immediately adjacent to the White Cloud, it breaks away and it essentially is taken by the current and it starts crashing into all these other boats, spilling hot embers onto them and so forth. So it's spreading that way. And then, like I said, the wind's blowing it inward. And in the end, something like 450 buildings are burned to the ground.
Fatalities?
That is one of the most amazing things about this. There were very few actual fatalities, a handful really. And I guess that is I guess that was the work of the firemen in some sense, because the alarms went out very quickly after the fire was discovered. They're ringing their bells. People, of course, are all seeing all 10 fire companies that existed at that time come rushing out. And so people were actually able to get ahead of the fire for the most part.
Well, you mentioned firemen. That's an interesting part of the story, too, because there was no fire department.
That's right. There was no municipal fire department. Everything was, in terms of fire protection in the city of St. Louis, there were 10 private fire companies. And these fire companies were a cross between a fire department and a fraternal organization. Mm-hmm. And these guys they're really the heroes of the city, not only because of the work they did to fight the fire and fires in the city all the time, but most people don't realize that they also took up the job of caring for people during the cholera epidemic as well. It's kind of a forgotten part of the story. There were no nurses at that time. So that job was taken up by the firefighters and by the sisters of the various religious orders. And they put themselves in great risk, obviously, every day in both positions.
How did they fight the fire? Was it a bucket brigade, or did they have anything approaching reasonable firefighting equipment?
Well, they had fire engines, what they called fire engines, pumper engines at that time, all hand pumped, of course, essentially wagons with these apparatus on the back. They had hoses that they could hook up to the city's water system, which was horribly inadequate and actually gave out halfway through the fire. Yes, but they were employing the bucket brigades and everything else. At one point, the fire obviously overwhelmed these groups of men. They could not. They realized they could not fight it alone, so they began employing volunteers for the most part. And at one point, it's estimated up to 1,000 men were fighting this fire in the city. And yeah, they're employing buckets, they're using wet blankets, anything they could find.
And blowing up buildings along the way to create fire breaks so the fire could not spread.
Yeah. If there's one individual that stands out, of course, in the fire story, it's Thomas Targhee, who was the captain of the Missouri Fire Company. And it is his idea, his plan, essentially, to create this fire break. And it's so hard to imagine the scene. It just must have been incredible. You have a situation where the air is just saturated with sparks and burning embers flying all around in this heavy wind and roaring of the fire. And this individual picks up barrels of gunpowder and runs through the city to blow up these buildings. And he sacrificed his life, but it worked.
Boy, your description of what they found of him after the explosion that took his life was really quite remarkable and ghastly.
Yeah, it was. As you can imagine, anyone that's holding a barrel of gunpowder that goes off prematurely, it's not going to be pretty. And yeah.
And he had a touching scene in the book, him saying goodbye to his wife before going out to fight the fire.
Exactly. He knew the danger, obviously, and he goes home and according to the story, he asked his wife's permission, and she
don't
said
we
yes.
all?
Yeah. Yeah, and he essentially kisses his wife and kids goodbye, and then he goes off, and has a tragic ending.
What were the papers saying in the days immediately after the fire? Were they saying that we're done, the city is done, anything like that?
No, it was just the opposite. It was just the spirit of we're going to rebuild, we're going to rise from the ashes, and I think that's one of the real takeaways from this book is, this is really a book about survival. It's a book about overcoming, and the people certainly had that spirit. They immediately after the fire, what they called the burnt district, they began to clean up and rebuild, and you have to really admire them for pressing on. But at the same time, you think about it, you think, well, life was often tragic at this time, and if everyone had given up, certainly the city and this country would not have progressed. They had to have that spirit.
Yeah, well, it's certainly good to hear that our ancestors reacted in this way. I've got a couple of emails here I'd like to read and invite listeners who have questions about this period to give us a call if you'd like to join the conversation. 382-8255 is the number. That's 382-TALK. You can send us an email to talk@stlpublicradio.org or a tweet at STL on air. Connor writes, I am a teacher at Clayton High School. I teach a social studies elective called History of St. Louis. I teach about the Great Fire of 1849, wondering if St. Louis had experienced any large calamities like it before that year.
No, actually. There was, other than the 1833 cholera epidemic, things had been relatively quiet. There were certainly fires in the city and things like that. Steamboats had caught fire down on the levee and different situations, but there was never anything of that size, anything that enormous that had ever happened.
Mary O'Reilly wants to take us back to the cholera part of the story. She writes, did you happen to find any mention of Thomas O'Reilly, M.D., newly minted physician and new arrival from Ireland? He was instrumental in clearing up the cholera epidemic in 1849, we've always been told. Then he decided to stay instead of going on to the gold fields of California as originally intended. He was my great-grandfather.
Oh, that's great. That's great. There were a number of physicians, actually. O'Neill doesn't immediately come to mind.
O'Reilly.
O'Reilly. But St. Louis was fortunate and that they had a number of physicians who had some of the previous experience, as I mentioned before, of the 1833 experience, but they were also men of science. And they learned a great deal from the 49 cholera epidemic. And they actually would use that and the knowledge that they passed on to their students later on. They really prepared the city for yet another cholera epidemic that happens in 1866. And right after the Civil War. And so St. Louis was fortunate. They learned a great deal, and they remembered those lessons.
You know, in promoting this program and your visit here today, I asked the question, did any good come of this? And I'm thinking particularly of the fire. And actually, it was very, very, and the cholera epidemic was very influential in the way this area grew.
Yeah. So, you know, the city before the fire was ramshackle in many ways. You know, there was, buildings were clustered together, tightly close together, a lot of wood frame buildings up against brick, but the brick was often a wood frame structure as well to the most degree. The city really took upon itself to upgrade the building codes and to improve the streets and to drain the swampy areas because of the cholera. And there was really this renewal that happens after 1849. And as I said, you know, the city learned lessons, and it put those lessons to practice. You know, they put it in good use for many generations, actually. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things I like to point out is I really think that was the basis of St. Louis becoming a medical, a health regional health center. Because I really think that generation remembered that, and they supported medicine. They supported the construction of hospitals, and this went on for, right through the end of the 19th century.
You also point out that people moved westward to get to a little cleaner air, and places like Kirkwood came into being at about this time as a result of that kind of migration.
Yeah, that is a direct result of 1849, is the fact that one of the things I don't talk about in the book, simply because it is a very complicated story, is the fact that the railroad, the Pacific Railroad, was chartered in 1849. And so construction begins a couple years after that. And as soon as the rail line starts going west from St. Louis, individuals that could afford to essentially buy country homes begin to build their homes along the railroad. And that serves as the germ of these communities, the core of these communities like Kirkwood and Webster that grow up because they want to get out of the city in what they feel is a more healthy environment.
And as you've already indicated, the infrastructure was improved, sewers and that sort of thing, a direct result of that. One other point that you make in the book concerns the cemeteries that developed, the park-like cemetery, which was not a feature prior to this time.
Yeah, and that was again really kind of it was a part of a national movement. There's something called the rural cemetery movement that is going on in this country. Early part of the Victorian period, when people began to see cemeteries as not just some place to bury the deceased, obviously their loved ones. They envision a more park-like setting, and Bellefontaine Cemetery, for instance, it grows out of this movement, and they're founded, you could say, at the right time in 1849. Obviously, they needed places to bury the cholera victims, and they created these memorial gardens for the first time, not only in St. Louis but across the country. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that, unfortunately, for so many people, life was short, and they wanted to be able to spend time with those that had passed, that they hadn't had enough time to spend with in life. So they would go out and they'd actually have picnics and things like that in the cemetery. It was like a park. So.
I should mention there are other things that you deal with in the book, and we'll talk a little bit about them as time allows. But I also wanted to mention the police. You have an entire chapter talking about the night watchman. Like the fire department, there wasn't much of a police presence per se.
That's right. It was, for the most part, there were paid watchmen in the city. They referred to them as police, but it was not an organized police force. And they had a rather dubious reputation. It was very political. These were all patronage jobs for the most part. And so whatever party was in power at the time, whether it be the Democrats or the Whigs, they would fight over, who would get these appointments. And then there would be constant criticism. Well, this party and this side isn't doing a good job of policing the city. But they were facing, these policemen, these watchmen. It is really amazing when you read these stories. They're facing so many situations that you see in the news today. They're dealing with certainly an increasing amount of crime. Not always effectively dealing with it, but at the same time, they're dealing with horrible instances of alcohol abuse and drug abuse, and there is a lot of situations where officers were being hurt on the job. It's very interesting how topical it is.
Also something that was taking place in those days that we're familiar with today. During the time of the fire, there was a lot of looting going on. This is not a new modern phenomenon.
No.
This takes place, I guess, whenever, and always has taken place whenever there's this kind of disruption.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things about it is, of the few fatalities that actually happened during the fire, a number of them were looters. They were people that had snuck into buildings to try to pilfer whatever they could, and then they would get caught, in the fire. But there was and you see this not only in 1849, but you see on either side of it so many riots that happened in the city as well, more or less vigilante riots. And I think that was because there just wasn't an effective police force to keep things under control. So the citizens would take things into their own hands. You
spend considerable time in the book also talking about race relations and the plight, if you will, of the African Americans at this time. It was a bad time to be black, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. It was a time when the laws were becoming more and more strict, not only for those who were enslaved, but for free persons of color as well. The abolitionist movement was in full swing, and Missouri being a slave state, this made slave owners very nervous, and they looked on free persons of color with total suspicion, and they saw them as a bad example to their slaves, and so the law was constantly becoming more and more strict as far as movement. These are people, free persons that they had to have passes to move around their own city. It was a horrible time. Yeah,
well, it's that chapter in and of itself is certainly worth looking at for that part of our history. And this too was the time of the Dred Scott decision. I mean, this was not exactly the year, but this was the time when all of that was beginning to unfold.
Yeah. His freedom case is in the court already, and he's spending a lot of time sitting around waiting for decisions to be made, unfortunately, and it would be essentially another 8 years before those decisions were made for him.
You go into a couple of crimes that time won't allow us to go into detail about that, but a character surfaced in conjunction with the trials related to these crimes, an attorney by the name of Edward Bates. And let's talk a little bit about him, because here's a guy that history really doesn't remember very well, and yet he was quite an influential character. Tell us about Edward Bates.
Yeah, so Edward Bates was a Virginian by birth, and he comes to St. Louis in the territorial days when Missouri was still a territory. He has family here that are already in his brother had been secretary of the territory, and so he's immersed in politics pretty early in his career, and he's a very interesting character. He was an excellent attorney. He really makes his name for himself as a defense attorney in the city and had several high-profile cases. But his reputation grows and he becomes involved in politics to a degree that he becomes a national figure. And his star really starts to shine after 1849 because he is very vocal on trying to keep the slavery question, trying to keep it going, but he took a very moderate position. He was very involved in things like the Colonization Society and so forth. When 1860 rolls around, his name is put before the Republican National Convention to be the presidential nominee for 1860, and of course he's beat out by Abraham Lincoln. So.
The history could have been quite different had he been a little more successful at that.
Yeah.
One other thing I wanted to mention, and getting back to the slavery issue, some very famous names that we're familiar with today were associated and have lived throughout the decades: Skinker, O'Fallon, Sappington, Bissell, Dorset, McKelvey, all very, very active slave owners.
Yes. Yeah, O'Fallon, and you see these names over and over. And yes, they were certainly involved in, these were large landowners, and they were farmers, and unfortunately they were slave owners as well.
And their names live on, of course, in names of towns and names of streets and roadways and all the rest of it.
Yes.
Well, most interesting indeed. As time winds down, you said you've learned a lot since you published the book. What are some of the things in a minute and a half or so you find interesting that you wished you'd been able to include?
Well, it's further descriptions. As I mentioned before, I wasn't able to get into the railroad story, and which is a great story in itself, and it's probably a whole book in itself. But there's some great descriptions that I've really wish I could have used. I just found a letter this morning, as a matter of fact, that talks about this gentleman was writing to his brother, and he says, he said, I don't know if I told you that I've returned to the city of mud, which of course is referring to the streets.
Sure.
And, he's talking about the downpours and how the streets were just impassable.
Is there any plan to perhaps do a sequel to this somehow, or what are you working on now?
Well, I haven't made that decision yet, but I'm starting to think there may be enough for a sequel. So,
well, it's fascinating stuff. It's a great read, and anyone who is interested in history, and particularly the history of this particular region, should pick up the book. It is titled Fire, Pestilence, and Death, St. Louis, 1849. Christopher Allen Gordon, thank you so much for being with us and writing the book.
Thank you.
It's been a lot of fun to read and a lot of fun to talk with you about that. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to conservation and careful management of the state's forests to make them more resilient and better habitats for wildlife. ChooseWood.com.